I introduce, that'd be great. So good evening everyone, my name is Holly Joseph and I am the Director of the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism at the University of Reading, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event on family language planning and policy for multilingual families. So tonight's event is aimed primarily at multilingual family members who want to learn more about how to maintain their home language alongside other languages and want advice on how best to do so. But I know we also have some practitioners and others in the audience, which is fantastic. And please feel free to contribute to the discussion in whatever role you are bringing. So we have two experts in multilingualism here who will be talking about family planning and policy, Professor Ludovica Serratrice and Eowyn Crisfield. So Ludovica is a professor of bi and multilingualism at the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences at the University of Reading, and Ludo did her PhD in linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, and then she moved to the University of Manchester where she worked for 16 years. A long time before moving to Reading in 2016, and her research interests lie primarily in language acquisition and processing in preschool and school-aged children, and she's passionate about co-producing research with teachers and speech and language therapists working with EAL and multilingual children. And Eowyn, it has over 20 years experience in the field of applied linguistics, which includes research, teaching and teacher training and supporting bilingual families. She's currently a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University in English language and TESOL, with a focus on the PG Cert teaching multilingual learners. Eowyn has developed a number of unique services, including family language planning and a whole school Every Teacher is a Language Teacher professional development programme for language support in schools. So welcome to both Ludovica and Eowyn. A little bit of housekeeping. So to begin with, Ludovica will be asking Eowyn some questions as an expert in family language planning and policy. So for this part of the event, I'll ask you please to keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. When they get to the end of that discussion, you're very welcome to put on your cameras, and if you want to ask a question, to put on your mic, or if you prefer, you can post your questions in the Q&A or chat sections, which you can see hopefully at the top of your screens on the left. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded and will probably be uploaded to our YouTube channel. I'll post the link to that at the end of the meeting within the next few days. So bear that in mind if you're going to come on camera and ask a question. Okay, and finally, I know that many of you submitted some questions when you registered for the event, and we hope to get to those towards the end of tonight's discussion, but do bear in mind that some of those questions will probably be answered by the discussion that you're about to listen to. So without further ado, I will pass over to Ludovica and Eowyn. Thank you both.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly. And thank you, Eowyn, for accepting our invitation. I'm really happy that you're here, be it virtually, but, you know, we're so used to doing these things, you know, in space. So maybe we could start with you telling us a little bit about your own sort of background and your own, how you developed an interest in family language planning and family language policy.
So, it was really quite accidental. I did study applied linguistics. I was an English teacher, first of all, English as a second language in Canada. And then while I was doing my master's in applied linguistics, we moved to the Netherlands, and we moved there when my oldest daughter was about 4 months old. So we'd already made the decision to raise her bilingually, English and French. I spoke French to her and my husband English, and we added Dutch into our family language plan because we were moving to the Netherlands. And I found myself surrounded by all kinds of people living in the in the international sector in the Netherlands, choosing really very explicitly not to expose their children to Dutch because Dutch is a useless language. Not enough people speak it. Why would we bother? And I just thought, God, that's so short-sighted. Because if you're, an English-speaking family living in the Netherlands, that's your child's best chance to become bilingual. So why wouldn't you take it? And so I really started doing parent seminars first and foremost. And I thought that those would be the parents that I would be talking to. But more and more, it became parents like me who were raising their children with multiple languages and really just wanted to talk to somebody about how hard it is and if they're getting it right, and, you know, to know a little bit about the research. And so, you know, that's kind of all the way back in 2003, 2004, over 20 years ago now. And it's just kind of, you know, grown from there as my children have grown and as I've lived in different places. It's kind of something I've always taken with me, is that interest in supporting families to make family language plans and realistic goals for their children.
Great. So maybe we can sort of start from the beginning and talk a little bit about terminology, because some people in our audience might be familiar with the term family language policy. You use family language planning. The two things are not exactly interchangeable. Do you want to tell us a little bit how you situate yourself and what those two terms mean to you?
So I guess I would ask you first, what do you think, what does family language policy mean to you?
Well, I mean, sort of, if you think about, you know, the definition in the literature, so family language policy is really sort of three areas about sort of beliefs, practice, and management, right? So, so in these three things are interlinked. I wonder whether maybe when you're talking about a family language plan, it's like the more concrete aspect of practice and management that you're talking, although it must be informed by beliefs to some extent. So just wonder how you feel about this.
Yeah, I think essentially that is how I would characterize it, is that a family language plan is very much, it's not necessarily a written document. A lot of people get put off by the term, you know, plan, as if we have to write it. It's not necessarily a written document, but it's a sense of knowing your own language ideologies as a person and as a family unit, knowing what you want for your children for languages, and then really having a clear plan to ensure your children get enough input. So, you know, the particular circles that I worked with initially and still do is, you know, kind of globally mobile families and immigrant families, where they may be a very small community of practice using their particular language with their children, but they really want them to have it. And so it's not like you know, bilingual societies where everybody gets a lot of everything. And we know that children need input to develop language. And so it's really for me, the heart of the family language plan is just really thinking carefully about where do we want to go with this language? How much kind of ballpark input would that require? And then where's that coming from? You know, who's going to use the language? How are they going to use it? How are we going to ensure that our children are getting enough to meet those language goals? And so I'd say it's definitely more the management side, but it's informed by ideologies and beliefs as well, because those are often in conflict in families.
Yeah. So it's interesting because somebody in the form asked a very interesting question that we were just talking about a minute ago, whether families even know that they have a family language policy. What do you think? Do you think people, I mean, also maybe not having a plan is a plan in a way?
Yeah, I think in part it depends on where they are. You know, I've had the great good luck to do work with some schools in Kenya and in Mozambique and in India, which are all very linguistically diverse places. And when I talk about family language planning, they look at me like they have no idea what I'm talking about, because in those contexts, nobody thinks about it, they just do it. And I think if you're raising a child in a bilingual or multilingual community, you don't need a plan in the same way as when you're a German, Spanish couple living in the Netherlands with your child in a French, you know, in a Dutch English school. You need to be more in charge than you would. And so I think a lot of families don't need a family language plan or policy. I think that those that do are, you know, those minority languages. And I think that they may not know overtly that they have a policy, but you definitely hear the language ideologies coming out and how parents talk to their children. I like to listen, you know, on the streets and things, don't use English with me, use our language, or don't use that language with me, or, you know, those kinds of conversations we have, which is in effect the family language policy in action, whether the parents recognize it or not.
Yeah, whether it's explicit or more implicit. I mean, a lot of the things that we do are also informed by implicit beliefs, right? So I was thinking, so you mentioned earlier something that is really important, goals, and I guess realistic goals, right? So the importance of having very clear what it is that you would like to get out of your family language plan. This is something that comes sort of across quite clearly in your book as well.
Yeah, I think that, parents can be a bit complacent and feel that as long as I'm using my language with my child, they will develop it. And that's absolutely, as we know, not the case. You can speak your child to your language all the time, and they may choose never to use it with you. And so I think that, there's an element of really being intentional and knowing where you want to go. So I meet internationally parents all the time who say, I'm German. I want my child to go back to Germany for university because it's free. So they need to be able to use German at a university level. You're like, okay, so that requires a lot of planning and a lot of effort to get a child who's born and raised in Thailand to, academic level in German. And so the more foresight the parents have about what they want, what they want their kids to be able to do, the more time they have to plan for that to happen. Because what we do notice is that, language will plateau at kind of a 9 or 10-year-old level, where you can say all the things you need to say, but it's not very complex and not very,
functional,
functional, but not really academic or, fit for working or as an adult or going to university.
Yeah. So, I mean, literacy obviously comes in sort of, again, whether you could be bilingual, but not biliterate. So deciding is also an important decision, right? That you need to make quite consciously and intentionally to support that.
Yes, absolutely. How much of an effort you need to make depends on how close or distant your languages are. So, for example, my daughter learned to read and write in French first because she went to a French school. She transferred that very easily to English with the occasional odd spelling error. But if you have a child who has to learn another script, you have to plan for that very intentionally in reading and in write, by reading to them and noticing with them, and then eventually by learning to write it. And it does definitely take more time and effort to learn another script. And so insofar as they're transferable, there's less to do. But where there's less transferability, it's a bigger hill to climb.
Yeah, for sure. And sort of, I guess, places like complementary schools have also got a role to play. I don't know if that's something that your children benefited from while you were abroad, or.
So they didn't, because they had their languages at school.
Okay.
Just by virtue of the schools that they went to. But I'm a huge supporter of complementary language schools. I think that they are a wonderful, wonderful gift to the community. But not all complementary schools are created equal. Because, well, here in the UK, certainly they're not funded.
Yeah.
So it's up to the community to fund them. It's also up to the community to decide what they want to do with them. And so what I don't like to see is children spending the greater part of a weekend day doing very laborious, rote book work in these kind of, whether you call them complementary language schools, Saturday schools, heritage language schools. It's that opportunity to go and do your language on the weekend. And I think overall they're great, but some of them I would say are too academically focused. And then the children end up not liking them and not wanting to go to do another hour, 5 or 6 hours or 3 hours of work on the weekend. I think that I've seen others that do, history and geography and dance and music and language. I think that kind of, multidisciplinary approach is perhaps more effective.
Yeah, for sure. Because I suppose you can maybe drag a preschool child to a Saturday school when they're like very young, but the moment they become a little bit older, they might not want to do that if it's an effort, if it feels like homework.
Yes.
Yeah,
if it just feels like more work.
Yeah, exactly. I don't blame them. So thinking more in terms, and again, so we've talked about the role of parents, but also now we're talking a little bit about the role of complementary schools, but also more generally, right? So there is like a whole series of actors that are around the family, like the extended networks, some of whom may have maybe conflicting desires and aspirations for the children in question. The schools, you know, if children go to a mainstream school where they only speak and use the societal language, the school, you know, also has a role to play to some extent, maybe in supporting the parents that want to keep their heritage language at home. So can you talk a little bit about sort of these forces that may not always go in the same direction sometimes?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things I talk about when I talk about family language planning is your family language plan isn't only for you, it's so that you can have really clear conversations with other people about the particular role they play, because people don't always do what you want them to do. In the absence of good information. And when we first moved to the Netherlands, my daughter was 4 months old. And so I was at home with her. But when she was about a year old, I went back to school to finish my MA, and I got a babysitter for her 3 times a week. And I chose a Dutch speaking babysitter because we had, you know, we wanted her to have Dutch. And about, I don't know, almost a year later, I said to the babysitter, you know, I take her out to the shops and it doesn't feel like people understand like people talk to her in Dutch. It doesn't feel like she understands very much. What's your impression of her Dutch? And she said, oh, I speak to her in English. It's easier.
I have no idea what Dutch
So
is like.
I learned that the hard way. If you're hiring a Dutch babysitter so your child can learn Dutch, tell them.
Yes, exactly.
And we do have to be really explicit. And, you know, and often I find it can be hard with grandparents. If grandparents share the majority language, they want to communicate with their grandchildren. So they're like, why can't we just use English with them? But if the Portuguese speaking grandparents use English, then who's using Portuguese? And so the earlier you can set those expectations about, you know, your role in our family language plan is to help our child develop in this language. And here are some games and books and things you can do. But you know, just because we know in our brain what we want them to do doesn't mean they necessarily know. And so we have to be very clear with everybody involved, from our children's teachers to the health visitor, if we have one, to babysitters, family, really everybody involved.
And have you ever come across, because I think this was a question that came up in the form, when parents have got you know, 2 different sets of family language policy, because that could be the case, right? That maybe parents want different things for their children.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, language is very deeply emotive. And so like anything else in family life, we don't always agree about what's the right strategy or what's the right plan for our children. And, you know, over 20 years of doing family language planning, I've seen really, really critically how it can create really
tension.
Not beyond tension. I've been involved in divorce cases that were, I mean, language wasn't what caused it, but language is what they blamed.
Yes, it was the symptoms rather than the cause.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you really feel deeply that you want your child to have your language and your partner doesn't support that because your language is useless or not as high status or not as useful, it can be really, really divisive. And so I think that, you know, one of the benefits of having a family language plan is that in that goal setting phase, you can kind of let it all out. What are your goals for your language and for your children? And really you need to agree on your goals before you can make a family language plan. You can't have parents going in 2 different ways. And so at that point, you know, if you need some mediation or some support or something, but essentially the parents need to be aligned. Otherwise the children are caught in the middle with, you know, mommy saying this, you know, use this language, and daddy saying, no, use this language. And that's absolutely not fair.
Yeah, for sure. So which brings me again sort of to because we've talked about parents, grandparents, schools, other adults, but this brings me to, you know, the child, right? Which is, you know, the children are at the center of all this. And again, maybe and family language plan, you know, you can formulate a family language plan even before the child is born, for example, because you already know that there's going to be a multilingual situation. So the child isn't even physically there yet. And then, of course, when they're very young, they don't have that much say in what happens. But how do you see children's agencies, and how do you see that playing out as well across the various stages of a children's lives?
Yeah, I think we underestimate how young children are when they start to have attitudes about their languages and opinions about their languages. And, you know, I've known children who were put into immersion schools and didn't learn a word of the language because they just decided they didn't want to. My older daughter, who was French-English bilingual, was 4.5 when our twins were born. We brought them home from the hospital. She said, I'm going to speak to them in English because English children are more fun. Okay. Okay. So I just contextualize. She went to a French school, but all of our social life was in English. So
Okay.
English was the
Makes
fun language.
sense.
But, you know, and she stuck to that. She wanted them to be English speakers because she thought they'd be more fun. And that had a massive, massive impact on their ultimate fluency in French and in English. And to this day, they're 16 now, and it still has an impact. And now she complains that their French isn't good enough.
Her fault entirely.
But I think the sibling relationship, and I think as soon as, you know, if you have an older sibling who goes to school in the majority language, they will come home and want to play in that language. And so the language of play will slowly shift. And so it can be really, really difficult to overcome kind of those microcosms of language that exist around a child that give them really clear messages about which languages are more valuable or useful. And sometimes children as young as 2 or 3, they pick up on those and they start refusing to use a language that they associate with, you know, a person they don't like, or a situation they don't like, or a kind of food they don't like. You know, and that only continues up until their teens, when, you know, you can't make your teenagers do very much, and you certainly can't make them use your language, no matter how hard you try. And so I always say to parents, remember that, you know, at the heart of it is your parenting relationship. You should never damage your parenting relationship for your language plan, because if you do that, they will lose the languages. But if you go with empathy and with discussion and talking to your kids along the way, even if they're not where you want them to be at 12 or 16 or 22, they maybe will still get there because they have positive attitudes about the language and positive experiences. And it's amazing what happens when you're 18 or 19 and all of a sudden it's quite cool to know French
Exactly.
or Spanish or some other language. They oh gosh, I wish I worked a little harder on that, because the girls think it's really cool.
For sure. Yeah, so clearly, so it's also dynamic, right? So sort of what happens when you're age 3 or 4 or 10 is not what happens at age 15 or 17, or maybe when you're older, you can, you know, take travel, you know, for abroad for a year, and that suddenly that language becomes really important. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of, so you said you worked with families in international schools mostly, or, you know, families that have relocated from abroad for a period of time. And I was wondering whether you've done any work, say, for example, in mainstream schools with maybe migrant families that have not maybe necessarily decided to move, but they've had to relocate because of, you know, economic situations, or I don't know, war, or more traumatic events that you know, that is not just somebody deciding to go and take up a new job somewhere else.
Yeah, take a new job. Yeah, I haven't done as much of that, simply because when I was working in the Netherlands, I didn't feel confident enough in Dutch to do that work within the immigrant community in the Netherlands. And so I did it tangentially within international communities. For example, we were in The Hague, and that's where all of the big UN tribunals are. And so I did quite a lot of work with the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, looking at family language planning, where there's been trauma involved in languages and, you know, the kinds of decisions parents make. And then, you know, in the UK, I've had some experience with, you know, just kind of locally, but it's the kind of thing that gets overlooked a lot. In the work we do with refugees and migrants, I think everybody's so focused on education and helping them learn English that we don't think enough about their other languages. And I think that's an oversight. There's definitely a need. And you know, whatever ways in you can find into those communities, because they're the ones where the children are most at risk of language attrition, because their parents don't feel the languages are valuable. They think they're holding them back. They really want them to assimilate. And that kind of language loss is, I mean, the impact is significant, kind of educationally, socially, emotionally.
Yeah. And also there is, you know, now quite a bit of research as well, looking at maintenance of heritage languages and general well-being and mental health. So some of these things are also very important in that context.
And identity development and all of those kinds of things that are, you know, of increasing. finally of increasing interest to researchers rather than just researching the cognitive advantages.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so this is what I always say. Like for me, the bilingual advantages that you speak and or understand two languages. And you know, if there is anything else after
absolutely.
that, great. If it doesn't, that's what
but
it
it's
is.
not the focus.
Exactly, no. So I was thinking, so if you have to think, you know, now you say you've got, well, obviously a lot of personal experience and more than 20 years working with families in a, you know, in many different contexts. If you had to identify, I don't know, like the top sort of 2-3 challenges and then ways to overcome them that you've seen, you know, successful strategies that people have used over time, what would you say? Like, you know, the thing that people come to you with more often. I'm guessing maybe it's like, I'm speaking to my child in, I don't know, Italian, and they speak back in English.
Yeah, my child won't speak my language. Classic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, you know, it is, depending on where you live, it can be very, very difficult to raise a child with languages. I mean, I know that since we moved from the Netherlands to the UK, my children's language proficiencies in all of their languages has gone down. And so it can sometimes feel like a very lonely battle if you're the only Italian speaking parent in your community here in England, or, you know, indeed anywhere else. And so I think building community is really, really important. Children are not predisposed to work hard for something that doesn't bring them a lot of benefit. And so if they think, I have to work really, really hard to speak Italian to mom, but I know she speaks English too, and nobody else uses Italian with me, they're going to weigh that up and go, actually, there's really no use in me working that hard. And so we absolutely have to build community so that our children see that our languages aren't just about us, but they're about a wider community. It's not always easy because, you know, you get together all the Italian families living in Oxford so that their kids can hear Italian, and the kids all go to school together in English, and they're all using English, and the parents are all using Italian. And so
actually,
sure.
sorry, I want to just tell you like a little anecdote. It's always like, for an adult, it's obvious, but for a child, it's an incredible thing, right? The sense of that there is a community of speakers, right? So this was the son, the eldest son of my supervisor in Edinburgh, who's an Italian speaker, and the children were born in Edinburgh. So, but they had, you know, Italian speaking friends and babysitters. So they had Italian in their lives, but they were adults. Anyway, so they went to Rome, where they always went, and this child, I think, was 4, and they were at a playground, and, you know, she was sitting on a bench, the child went off to play, and then he comes back and says to his mom, like, Mamma, qui tutti I bambini parlano italiano. And he said, Mom, here all the children speak Italian. And obviously, that's clearly, you know, what Italian children do in Italy. But that was a massive revelation, right? So just thinking this idea, there is a community of speakers, you know, children that I can use Italian to play with. So this really always stayed with me because it's just so meaningful. Yeah.
I think I know who your supervisor was.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really the, you know, those moments where they realize that all that work they're doing have meaning and have purpose and are not just like this random thing that mom wants them to do. Just really, they change the game completely, and it's hard to replicate when you don't have a big community around you, and it's hard to replicate in ways that are authentic. Parents often say to me, "Can I just pretend I don't understand them?" I said, no, you can't lie to your children. That's just not nice. But you can hire a teenager to lie to them. So go out into the community, see if you can find an Italian-speaking 15-year-old who will just come and read and play with your kids. And they can say, actually, my English isn't very good. Can you use Italian with me? Because, you know, it's that mentor relationship that older children, younger children can have. The older child is old enough to, you know, understand what you're doing and to go along with it, whereas 2 6-year-olds wouldn't. And they just need that authentic interaction, and so that they can almost unblock their tongue without being worried about it anymore, and just go, oh, I can do that. And they just need that opportunity to interact, because although input is critical for language acquisition, without interaction and output, you can never really figure out how to use it yourself.
Of course, yeah. And also I was wondering, obviously now we live in a very different place now from 20 years ago when your own children were small, were young. So there is a lot more sort of digital technology and ways of communicating online that, of course, we put to good use during COVID. So I was wondering, how do you feel about the use of digital media, or, maybe keeping in touch with distant family and relatives via, Teams, Zoom, WhatsApp, whatever it is? Did you see it's like a useful tool? It's got limitations.
I think it absolutely can be, but it has to be done in a way that is child friendly. There's nothing more painful, and I know I've done it with my kids, than sitting there with your child on Zoom and the grandparents are trying to have the conversation. The child's like, fine, no, yes, don't know. Kids don't interact as well with the screen. I think they're probably getting better at it than they were. But so what I encourage families to do is to have like meaningful engagement. So
Hello.
The grandparents, sorry.
Hello.
Grandparents have.
Could you please keep your mics closed? Thank you. Sorry, not to you.
Okay. So the grandparents have a book, a storybook that they're reading over Zoom, and maybe the parents have a copy too that the child is looking at, and they're asking questions about what's happening in the story, and you build up to it. So every night you're going to have 15 minutes of story time with Oma and Opa, or whoever they are. So I think those can work well. I've also worked with some platforms where the kids can, when they're a little bit older, play games with their grandparents. So through online gaming, board games. I'm not talking playing Fortnite with the grandparents.
Yes.
But there are online board game platforms where you can play, basic board games and talk while you're doing it. And so really kind of thinking about it as shared activities that happen online, rather than just trying to have conversations, I think are much more successful and kind of richer in terms of the interactions that you get. And then, leverage your children's use of tech time. The vast majority of children, have tech time in some way or another. And so if your language goals are for your child to be stronger in Spanish, well, then the TV only speaks Spanish and the iPad only speaks Spanish. You can absolutely do that, and until they're old enough to hack it. And figure out how to make it all speak English. But, everything that your child interacts with is a part of your language plan. And making those considered and considerate choices will help you maximize the input and the opportunities for interaction in the languages that get less time, just because of the way your life works.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I always think obviously children sort of will learn one language because they have to, but to learn 2 or 3, that not only they need the opportunity, but also the motivation, as you were saying earlier. Absolutely. So you really have to create an authentic context where children want to use that language. And I also wonder to what extent this is also dynamic, right? So you were saying children that have maybe sort of unwilling to speak a language, but then something happens, maybe moving to, I don't know, the country of origin of one of the parents. So these things also, the balance can shift, right? So clearly it's not set in
absolutely.
stone.
A child will most commonly have a dominant language, but that dominant language can change depending on the circumstances. So my oldest daughter was French dominant when she was quite young. And now she's definitely English dominant because circumstances changed. And, when you live and work internationally, I meet a lot of families where, they go home for the summer for 6 weeks and the kids' language skills would go up, 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 up. And then they come back to the Netherlands and they'd kind of go, and then go home for Christmas and then down to the end of the year. And it's that natural up and down that happens when I'm in a situation where I need to use it and I'm going to play with kids, so it's going to get better. And now I don't need to use it. And adults are like that too. My French is not as good as it was when I was living in France. My Dutch is not as good as when I was living in the Netherlands. And so we have to recognize that, as we always say, a bilingual isn't 2 monolinguals in one with equal proficiency. It's about, how do they use the language and what context do they encounter it? What purposes do they have? They'll have those. And the more context and purposes they have, the more we'll feel they're fluent, and the fewer they have, the more we'll feel like they're restricted.
Yeah, and obviously we talk a lot about language, but clearly sort of our language also goes with culture, right? So I'm thinking Italian is my first language. I'm a little bit attrited. I've lost a little bit of my Italian, although I go back regularly. But what I really lost a lot is like contact with popular culture, because you don't watch TV there, you don't, see things that are happening. So, but one way in which I've regained some of it is by following certain journalists or comedians on Instagram, for example. That's one way in which I found that technology has helped me reconnect with some aspects of my Italian culture that I had lost to some extent, because it's a quick and immediate way to do that. So again, I'm guessing with children as well. Obviously, younger children would probably be using TikTok more than Instagram, or but supervised, I suppose, right? Some of these things can also bring a sense of authenticity to not only the language but the culture.
Yeah, I think the culture piece is big, because we do know that children who grow up outside of their culture often don't really fit in. They don't know the popular TV shows. They don't know, they speak the language of their parents. And so they've got this really, elegant, very proper Italian, and they go back to Italy and the kids are all like, well, you're a bit weird. And so that kind of access to, to popular media or to watching television shows or TikTokers gives them that more everyday level of language that they're not getting from their parents, unless their parents are extremely hip.
Yes, exactly. There's always going to be a generational divide.
Yeah,
okay. So I don't know if there was anything else that you felt like well, first of all, last of all, maybe I'm gonna show your book, which is packed with super useful information, and it's just called Bilingual Families, a practical language planning guide, and it's published by Multilingual Matters. I think Holly was going to put that in the chat for people if they're interested. And so we've got a few questions, like I said, some of which you may have already addressed in our chat, but there may be some, Holly, that you might have identified that perhaps we didn't address that explicitly. And Eowyn, I think you had sight of them earlier. So if you're happy to take some of these questions, and then by all means, if people have got others, they can put them in the Q&A or come on camera, as Holly was saying earlier.
I mean, I think you've covered most of them. There's one very simple question, which is that you haven't covered, which is, how do you do homework? I'm not quite sure how that fits in with.
Oh, well, I always say to parents, insofar as it's possible, do the homework in your own language. Because, when we look at how language proficiency builds, we know that children build an immense amount of language at school, and if they're doing all of the academic stuff in not your language, they won't be able to do math in your language, and so then they'll feel that it's not as useful and they'll stop using it. And so if you start when they're young, it's difficult to do once they're older, but if you start from the get-go, if they bring home a reading book in English, the first thing you do is you read the story in your language. Make sure they understand it, talk about it, then go back and they can decode it in English. If they bring home math homework, you chat about the math homework with them in English. You might in your language, you might use some English along the way, but we have to get them used to kind of academic content in our language, or they'll never be able to manage it. And so do the homework as much as you can in your own language.
Yeah.
Children's homework is hard enough these days without parents trying to do it in another language.
Yeah, there's that intergenerational thing going on anyway, isn't there? That's not how we used to do it at school. And then if you sort of bring in other education systems and other languages, it gets very complicated. There's an interesting one about identity here. So it says, we're a British, German, Belgian, Bengali family and would like to know how we can best support our child build up an integrated identity as a multilingual learner. So obviously you have touched upon that, but I think when you've got such complexity in terms of the family identity and the family languages, that must be really, really, difficult to sort of keep on top of, and maybe have it clear in your mind what you want to do and how you want to raise your children. Have you worked with families with so many languages? And
I have, and I think really the absolute most important thing is that both parents are supportive of all the languages. Yeah. And that means that they give it a go too. So if a Bengali speaking mother is using Bengali with her child, that they can, expect the other partner to learn a couple of words as well. We have to see them as our family languages and not one parent's language and another parent's language. And we all have to be language learners. And so, my husband, who's mostly monolingual, that's what I call him in my book, it's what he is, he's always given a go to learn some of the Dutch my kids have, to learn some of the French that they have, to support the status of the languages and to support their efforts. And so we really have to frame it as these are the languages of our family. And they attach to different parts of our heritage, but it's all your heritage. And then within that, we look at how do we make connections across languages. So this is the word in German. Is it like that in any of your other languages? So it's a little bit like that in Italian, but it's not like that at all in Bengali. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder why that is. And I always say to families, get yourself a great wall map of the language families that your languages are from, so you can trace those connections, and you can go all the way back to Proto-Indo-European and go, look, Bengali and English are actually connected. And so that's why sometimes we can see similarities, but it really has to feel like these are the languages of our family. And they're all important for all of us. And sometimes that is a struggle for multilingual families, because we're a bit defensive about our own languages because we want them to be important, but we have to be collaborative.
Yeah. So do you feel that maybe it's actually harder if one parent is monolingual? So it sounds like your husband is not like this, but if you are monolingual and you haven't, the experience of learning multiple languages, you maybe think that it's easier than you think, or that, it's just like, well, you speak Bengali and Hindi and English, so just teach our children those languages, right? That's just like as simple as anything, so, but actually, if both parents are multilingual, then they have some mutual understanding of the complexity of it.
I think most people are aware of the fact that it can be challenging to learn a new language, whether they've done so successfully or not. But I think what really makes a difference for me in terms of attitudes is the relative importance of the languages that comes out through the parental roles. And so what I used to see a lot, and still do see a lot, is, for example, the mother speaks one language and the father speaks another. The mother also speaks the father's language, but the father doesn't speak the mother's language. And within that, then you get a kind of dynamic that's coming out that the powerful language, the language of employment, the language of the majority is dad's language. And so the kids pull away from the mother's minority language. And so we always joke in our family that our challenge was, my husband's an engineer and I'm a teacher. And so if you could become an engineer and have a really well-paid job speaking only English, why would you want to work hard like mom to speak 3 languages and be a teacher? And so there was always the risk that our children would perceive that actually the route to success is being monolingual. Yeah. And so that's why my husband was so active in their ongoing language activities, because he had to really show that, no, I think it's fabulous you speak French and Dutch way better than I do, and I wish I could. And I want you, I really support you in doing that. And so when you look at the relative status of the languages, if one is higher and one is lower, the parent who's the owner, if you will, of the higher status language has to absolutely support the lower status language, or it will just get lost.
Yeah. And it's also tied up with other issues around race and, immigration. And so, so, I mean, I've met various people, including my father, actually, who speaks Malayalam and who think that is not a language worth teaching your children, because no one's even heard of it, right? Let alone, anybody wants to speak it. So it's around dynamics within the family, but also within wider society, isn't it? And the languages that children learn in school are French and Spanish and German, whereas the languages that people speak in this country are, Bengali, Romanian, completely different languages. So there's a lot of complexity in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just saw a question, I think. Did I? No.
Maybe hands up.
Yes, a hand up. Sorry, who is that? Hi, do you want to come on?
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk, which was very insightful and helpful. Here's one question. This Brexit from 2019. Yeah. So I read a paper which said that so English will be more reasonable to be the official language in the UK after the Brexit. So I just was wondering, would that be harm to the European languages the survival of the European languages in the UK? Will that harm the the heritage language maintenance in the UK? So are there any language educational policies in the UK after the Brexit? Thank you so much.
I'm not sure it could get much worse. to be honest, I think that, you know, there's always been a challenge across, I would say, monolingual societies. The UK is not unique in this, but particularly English-speaking monolingual societies, to feel like if you have English, why bother with anything else? And I think that that has definitely, it's not decreased since Brexit. Whether it's going to make it more difficult, I don't know, because, you know, all of the good work done in the UK right now is done by the community language schools, the complementary language schools. It's not done by the government. There are no good policies. It's not like, you know, for example, Canada, which has, you know, governmental support for home and heritage languages. So, you know, you can get funding to open a school. None of that exists here already. And so I don't think that right now it's going to get any better, but I don't think that it's going to get worse per se.
It might, because they're closing modern foreign languages department at universities. So there are no people that are being trained to then teach in primary and secondary schools. So I'm not super hopeful, I have to say, at the moment, because we see this happening, right? Closing down MFL departments and linguistics in a lot of
but I think it's also looking at, you know, societal bilingualism or multilingualism in the round. I think that uptake for modern foreign languages has always been a problem, and it's absolutely getting worse. But I don't think that that's the language future of the UK. It's recognizing all of the languages that are spoken by the migrant communities, that when they say, the UK is a very monolingual place, no, it's not. It's a hugely multilingual place. And I think we just need to maybe make more effort to valorize those languages, because, you know, in some of the work I do with schools, it's far easier to motivate kids to learn Polish because they've got 5 Polish mates in their class than to try and teach them to learn French, because they don't go to France, they don't know where France is, they don't care about France. And so I think that, you know, if we look back to the roots of the communities and tap into that, we could change that slow decline of languages. And part of the problem is they're just not teaching languages that people hear or can use in their communities.
And also, I think you're right.
Let's all learn Bengali and Urdu and Polish and Romanian and Mandarin and all the other languages spoken around us here in the UK.
Yeah, but I always think that, like, the UK is a multilingual country with a monolingual mindset,
and absolutely monolingual habitus.
Yeah, so that's what we need to change. I mean, the languages are there. It's our attitude to these languages and to the resource that they are that we need to change. Yeah. I think there was another question, Holly.
Yeah, there's a question. Thank you.
And
did you have another one?
Another question. Yeah.
Go on.
I'm so sorry. Sorry.
No, go on.
I didn't read a lot of paper about that. Do you think most of the teachers in the UK in primary schools or elementary school or middle schools, do they support the heritage language of, you know, immigrant children? Like, do they have?
I think that really depends on the school, and, you know, there are schools that have excellent practice. I would say there are more schools that don't even know that that's a thing you can do. And so, again, for lack of any guiding policy, schools are left to their own devices to decide what they do. And you're not going to get whole scale change until you have some kind of driving policy. So if you look, for example, the island of Jersey, where I've been working now for 4 years, they now have the whole education system has an inclusive language policy, which means that every school on the island has a multilingual learner lead teacher. And their job is to make sure that all of the children's languages are supported, their cultures are supported, that they're visible, that they're integrated. But it's because they have that macro policy that holds the school system, the schools to account, that they can expect now to see good practice. But the UK has no such policy in place. And so it's really down to individual schools. And there are absolutely people out there who know what they're doing and who are doing great work. but because it's not visible in the teacher education or in, you know, how schools are assessed or inspected, it's an invisible skill some schools have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat just asking for recommendations of books or articles on the topic of multilingualism and identity. Obviously, your own book would be the first recommendation.
I don't actually talk about identity very much.
Okay, okay.
That'll be for the next edit. But there is more written. I'm sure that we can maybe send something out after.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's why. Another, I think, yeah, we've got time for one more question. So Teresa, do you want to come on, Mike?
Hello, can you hear me okay? Hello. Okay, hello, lovely to meet you. I wonder if you can maybe give me some suggestions. I'm working on a textbook about early years partnership with parents. And obviously one of the important things is working together to support family life, children's language development. So I'd like to ask you if you've got any other suggestions. Now I've jotted down, you know, perhaps the importance of the practitioner helping the parents to build a community. You were talking about how important that is. Also that practitioners should be as supportive of that plan, even if it's not explicit, but, you know, making sure that they're listening and understanding what the plan is. And maybe also that there should be perhaps an employment policy to recruit staff that reflect the diversity of the families. Is there anything, you know, can you think of any sort of, you know, top tips for?
I can think of so many. I think the early year setting should be inclusive physically and audibly of the languages of the children. So signage, books, stories, songs. You know, you should be able to point to children's languages on the wall and say, oh, that's so-and-so's language, isn't it neat? How do they do that? And I think the most important thing that early years practitioners can do is message to the parents, your language is your priority. You know, schools and early year settings have a lot of soft power over family language policy. And if the school is saying explicitly, actually, your language is so important to your child, when we send home books, we want you to read them in your language. When we ask you to play games, we want you to do it in your language. If they get one thing right, it's that messaging about the importance of the home language, because that will help the parents, you know, when it is difficult, and it is, they'll have that kind of boost behind them that even our child's English teacher says that our language is important, and so we're going to keep doing it. But you can help them by having books available in their own language they can take out, by, you know, taking the register in different languages, by having the parents come in and do story time, by all those other kinds of things that encompass that kind of culturally and linguistically inclusive environment.
Lovely, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think we'll tie it up now. So that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. And I hope you did all too. If you're not already, do sign up for updates from CeLM, and you can come to the next of our event, which is on the, can't remember, it's in March.
11th of March.
11th of March, thank you. I'll put the link in the chat, so if you want to sign up, you can sign up. And yeah, have a lovely evening, and enjoy building your family language policy. And thank you so much to Ludo and Eowyn for that excellent conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Ciao.